Hey everybody, this is Rykard here again, and welcome to part 2 of my team building guide. In our last episode, we discussed basic characteristics of various team members and things that you would want to look for when building your own team. So today's episode is going to be specifically dedicated towards building a defensive core, and I'm going to be talking about the one that I demonstrated in the last video and the reasons behind me picking those Pokemon and like the moves and things that they have that I really like. So before we get into any of that, let's get started by taking a look at a few characteristics that I felt were very important for you to consider when picking the defensive Pokemon on your team. So one of the first things you want to look for when building your defensive core on your team is looking for Pokemon that have high HP and or physical and special defense. Obviously, the better the HP, physical, and special defense on each Pokemon, the better, but sometimes you're going to have a Pokemon that is specifically dedicated to one type of wall, mainly a physical wall or a special wall, but again, if you can get a Pokemon that has good defenses for both, that's even better. As for another thing that you want to consider is picking Pokemon that have a multitude of resistances or immunities. Excuse me, sorry, my phone. Um, and with that, a lot of certain types often have a lot of these, such as steel types being one of the types in the game that resists the most things out of every other. So steel types generally do make good defensive Pokemon just because they have a ton of resistances. But there are a lot of other really cool type combinations too that can yield a bunch of resistances and or immunities as well. So that is something to also consider. As for the three of the defensive Pokemon when thinking of them as a unit, you want their resistances to support each other's weaknesses, meaning that if one of them is weak to one thing, you want the other to be able to resist it or be immune to it, so that you can have them support each other and bring out the appropriate wall to take a specific attack when you need it to. As for ways to deal damage, because defensive Pokemon typically don't have the offensive power to really hit very hard, one thing that you will want to have on any of your defensive Pokemon would be moves that can inflict status. And these can be moves that have status as a secondary effect, like I listed here, like Scald because it has a 30% chance to burn, or Body Slam because it has a chance to paralyze, but it could also just be a status move in general, like Toxic or Will-O-Wisp or things of that nature. Another thing that's really beneficial to a lot of walls because they aren't doing a lot of damage is having access to a move such as Seismic Toss or Nightshade, which have a consistent 100 base power at level 100, which is always really good. However, you do have to consider the fact that if your opponent is using a Pokemon with more than 404 HP and they make a sub, your Seismic Toss will not be able to break the sub, or Nightshade would not be able to break the sub, so just keep that in mind when using moves like that. As for another thing that's really beneficial for your defensive Pokemon, they should be able to at least set up entry hazards or remove them or something like that. Obviously, you could give that to an offensive Pokemon on your team, but typically it's reserved for a defensive Pokemon, so if they can set up spikes or toxic spikes or stealth rock or be able to remove them through rapid spin or something like that, that's also really nice. As for a way to keep your walls alive, they need to have, or they should at least have some type of access to recovery moves, such as, Synthesis or Recover or Roost, that kind of thing. Also, if your Pokemon does have the move Wish, that's actually really beneficial because then you can use Wish to not only heal your own HP, but also heal up the HP of another wall that you might be using that might not have healing, or just another team member in general. So Wish is absolutely fantastic on wall type Pokemon. As for another move to help support, phasing moves are great. Roar, Whirlwind, Dragon Tail, Circle Throw, those are all really good, especially against Baton Pass teams because you can just completely get rid of the boosts entirely by using them. It's always really good to have something that can phase something out because if something's setting up, you really don't want that to happen. And lastly, which is also a very important thing to consider, is if they have access to a move such as Heal Bell or Aromatherapy to heal off any status that you may be inflicted with on your team. And this works especially well if you want to do a really defensive team, where you just have basically like 6 walls or something like that, because if you have Heal Bell, you can pretty much put rest on everything on your team and just heal up everything and then get rid of all the status. So that's actually really cool too. But those are just some common characteristics of a defensive core that at least I felt were very important to consider when picking the Pokemon that you want to use for that. So to use my team as an example, I'm going to get right into showing you my physical wall and the reasons why I picked it. So let's take a look at that right now. So to be completely honest, the reason why I picked Wormadam is because I never used the ground version of it before, or the Sandcloak version. So that was one of the main reasons behind me picking it. But as for a more practical reason, I guess, it does have pretty good defenses, being base 105 defense and 85 special defense. However, the 60 HP really isn't absolutely fantastic, but because it has some pretty solid defenses, it doesn't really matter so much. Another reason why I felt like Wormadam would make a great physical wall is because it does have resistance to fighting, ground, and poison moves. Mainly the fighting and ground was what I was looking for, because a lot of common leads are wanting to fire off earthquakes, because those are the ones that generally set up stealth rock. And also a resistance to fighting moves is very important because of the presence of Sawk in NU. So having a Pokemon to resist that and also take the physical hit really well because of its high physical defense is something that I felt was a really good asset to my team. Another really core reason for picking it was because it doesn't have an electric immunity. And because of that, you're able to actually switch this thing on things that have Volt Switch and potentially force them to switch out if they're choiced in some way, which is really nice because if you can do that, any electric immunity is just really good. Another reason, obviously, since it is a ground type, it can set up Stealth Rocks, and this is actually a very new thing, being a Black and White 2 move tutor move. Another reason for picking it was that it has access to Rock Blast, so if a opponent wants to lead with Ninjask, I can just Rock Blast the Ninjask and kill it outright before it has any time to set up subs or anything, which is really nice. Another reason as well is because it has access to Sucker Punch, so I get priority in it. It's not a very powerful Sucker Punch, but it's still there in case I need to revenge kill something, like maybe a Swellow or something if I still have this thing alive. It's really nice to have just extra priority on your team. And lastly, it has a nice stab Earthquake, which can deal some pretty good damage to most other Stealth Rock users, because they generally are rock types. So that is basically the main reasons for picking Wormadam, other than just the fact that I wanted to use one. But as you can see here, these are all characteristics of what I basically just described, and then some because of how unique this Pokemon is in itself. As for my special wall, I decided to use Lickilicky for this team because I've never really used it before, and I know that it has some pretty impressive defensive stats. And as you can see right here, it has base 110 HP, 95 defense, and 95 special defense, meaning that it can take hits extremely well from both sides, and if I wanted to EV it to be a physical wall, I could have, but since I already had Wormadam, I decided to make it my special wall on this team, and it has done an amazing job of that. One great thing about about having a normal type in general as a special wall is it only has one weakness, which is to fighting type attacks. So you don't really have to worry about too many things hitting you for super effective damage, which I guess is another good thing for walls to have. Not a lot of weaknesses, even though this Pokemon only has one immunity slash resistance, which is its Ghost immunity, which isn't too common of an attacking type in NU, but it's still nice to have if I ever need it. Another great thing about Lickilicky is it does have access to Seismic Toss, meaning that can deal a solid 100 damage every time it uses it, and that's always a good thing. Also, it has access to Wish, which is absolutely fantastic, especially because of its incredibly high HP stat, meaning that not only will it be able to heal itself very easily and effectively, but I can also pretty much get most of the other members of my team up to full health if I get a safe switch in, which is really nice. Also, because of using Wish with Protect usually, because that's what most people do, Lickilicky is able to Toxic Stall extremely effectively, meaning that I am basically able to wear down my opponent very easily while I just constantly Wish and Protect. Now, for my team purposes, I didn't actually pack a couple of other moves that Lickilickys do have, um, but they often do pack Dragon Tail as a way to phase, which is something to keep in mind. And they also have access to Heal Bell, but mine did not for purposes of the team. I'm not exactly sure why I chose to do that, but that was just what worked for me. So if you do want to go with a move like Heal Bell or Dragon Tail on it, I didn't do that for my team, but that is also an option for Lickilicky if you're looking to use it as a wall. As for my middle wall, I decided to go with Lumineon because it's a Pokemon that I really enjoy using, and it does have some pretty good defenses to make it a solid middle wall, able to take hits from both sides if you EV it as such. So I decided to use this because it has base 69 HP, 78 defense, and 86 special defense, meaning that it has, as I said, pretty average defenses from both sides, meaning that if I need something to take a hit, I can always go to Lumineon because it will at least be able to survive one thing that isn't super effective. Another really great reason for having Lumineon around is because it does, being a water type, it has a resistance to ice, steel, and fire, which is absolutely fantastic, as ice and fire are very good attacking types. And even though steel isn't as common, it's good to have it in case of the occasional Mawile that you run into, which is probably going to be wanting to fire off iron heads all day. Another really great thing about Lumineon is that it has access to the Storm Drain ability, meaning that every time a water type attack is used against it, I will actually boost my special attack by one stage instead of being hit by it, giving me a water immunity. Also, being a water type, it does have access to Scald, so I get a 30% chance to burn every time I use it, which is really great because that will obviously improve its physical walling capabilities if I get a burn on a physical attacker. I'm obviously also supporting the rest of my team as well in that right. And then because I researched this Pokemon a lot, I realized that it had access to U-turn, which is really freaking cool because not a lot of walls can really use U-turn very well, especially in NU. So this actually can give me some pretty good switch initiative a lot of the time if my opponent wants to switch out after I successfully am able to take a hit from a type or from attack that I resist or something like that. So that'll give me switch initiative to help out the rest of my team, which is really nice. But Lumineon is just a really cool Pokemon. That was just basically one of my main reasons for using it, and the water immunity, obviously. So now, to basically wrap this up, I wanted to take a look at a type resistance chart that basically shows how these three Pokemon work together. So let's take a look at that right now. So as you can see here, and I know that the writing is pretty small, this is just a screen cap, but you have to bear with me for a second. All the green boxes with a 1 on them are things I resist or am immune to, and all the red boxes are things I am weak to. So as you can see, I resist fighting, poison, ground, ghost, steel, fire, water, electric, and ice, with the combination of the 3 walls on my team, which is some pretty good coverage overall. I get a ton of types resisted by them. And as you can see, as I was trying to point out before, pretty much all the weaknesses that they have are resisted by another member, with the exception of grass and flying, though I do have 2 other members on my team that can actually resist those, so that's really not as important in this video, I guess, because I do have those resists just elsewhere. But overall, as you can see, they do support each other extremely well. To talk a little bit more about how they work together, starting with Wormadam, obviously, as I said before, it is able to resist fighting moves, which Lickilicky is weak to, the only thing Lickilicky is weak to. And since fighting moves are typically physical, I can generally go into Wormadam as a safe bet against a fighting type attack that's going to be wanting to hit Lickilicky pretty hard. So that's always really nice. Also, with Wormadam being a ground type, it's immune to electric moves, so Lumineon's weakness to electric type attacks can be completely negated by switching into Wormadam, and obviously I can threaten out electric type with Earthquake. To think a little bit the other way, Lumineon actually supports Wormadam extremely well because Wormadam is weak to fire and water and ice, which a couple others too, but specifically those which Lumineon is able to resist very well and actually even get a boost potentially if I switch in on a water move, which means that even though Lumineon isn't the greatest attacker, having a +1 boost will then allow it to actually hit pretty hard while also being able to take hits because of my EV spread on it to make it more defensive. So overall, this is just basically kind of the things that I think about when I'm trying to build a balanced team with a pretty solid defensive core. So I hope this video helped and gave you some insight as to how I do this, so that you're able to go and potentially build a team of your own that's able to have a defensive core that supports each other's weaknesses. And if you're wondering where this site is, this is actually Maryland's Team Builder. So if you just Google that, you can find this website, put in the Pokemon, and see the weaknesses and resistances, which is very helpful in doing this because it's a lot easier to see it than try to figure them out for yourself. But that's it for this part. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed watching the explanation of how I built a defensive core with this team. And I hope you tune in next time, where I'm going to be basically talking about my offensive core on this team, or the offensive threats as I called them in the last video. So that is it for this video, everyone. So as always, thank you for watching, take care, goodbye, and I'll see you next time.